With the release of Wizardry 4, Surtech found itself in a deep problem. It's generally agreed upon that the company was poorly managed, being that it was slow to react and that one of its co-founders, Robert Woodhead, also known as King Trevor, was a massive weeaboo who often took long leaves of absence to travel to Japan for months on end. And that also did not help that he was one of the main programmers at Surtech. So every time he went on a leave of absence, development would pretty much hit a standstill. This, along with how different Wizardry 4 was, led to the game entering a development hell cycle, taking 4 years to be released when the previous games only took about 1 year each. To make matters worse, Wizardry 4 was poorly received by fans and critics alike, becoming a commercial flop. And it also did not help that Surtech had also established itself as a publisher, but the games that it did publish during this time really didn't sell all that well. We don't know exactly how much they sold, but we do know that they did not sell on the same level as the Wizardry series at least. Because of this, Surtech was now going through financial difficulties and it seemed that the company might close doors and Wizardry 4 would be the final entry into the series. That is, until they were unexpectedly saved by a Wizardry game that for the most part they didn't even make. This is Wizardry 5, Heart of the Maelstrom. Released only a year after 4, this is the final Wizardry game to use the original game engine, and the final entry into the main Wizardry storyline. And the game came as much of a surprise to fans as it came to Surtech. And that's because Wardna only had a support role in making it, and Trevor didn't even have a role at all. In fact, this would be the last Wizardry game to involve the original series creators in any capacity, because both of them would leave the company at around this time. It's kinda hard to tell who left when, but suffice it to say, the series creators weren't happy at Surtech, and there would even be some bad blood with Wardna taking Surtech to court at some point. But I'm not gonna go into that. Instead, let's just focus on how Wizardry found new leadership at around this point. Enter D.W. Bradley, and he's a bit of a controversial figure in Wizardry, because depending on who you ask, he's either the man who saved Wizardry or the man who killed Wizardry. And you can usually tell what type of Western old-school Wizardry fan you're talking to depending on how they feel about D.W. Bradley. D.W. Bradley is a programmer, writer, game designer, and a dungeon master. Basically, he's an all-in-one package, and he was making his own Wizardry-inspired RPG and looking for a publisher. But rather than publishing him, one of his contacts directed him to Surtech, and the company's founders, that is to say, Trevor and Wardna, who were already looking to leave Surtech, saw potential in him and his game. So the idea was simple. D.W. Bradley would spend 2 years retooling his game to fit in with the Wizardry series, which would then be released as Wizardry 5. And this would also mean that at one point, Wizardries 4 and 5 were both being developed concurrently. The game was a return to form for Wizardry, as you once again control a party of adventurers. But the difference is that they are in no way related to the previous party members. In fact, there's very little that connects Wizardry 5 to previous entries. What I mean is, in Wizardry 1, you create your heroes. In Wizardry 2, those same heroes go on a new quest. In Wizardry 3, you play as their descendants. And in Wizardry 4, you play as a villain from the first game. But here, there's basically nothing connected to the previous games, other than the fact that it takes place in the same city. I mean, you can still import characters from Wizardries 1, 2, and 3, but it's not really stated anywhere that these are the same adventurers or their descendants. It's all kept intentionally vague in that regard. With that said though, Wizardry 5 brought some much needed improvements to the Wizardry formula. For one thing, the story and quests were greatly expanded. Now, as you explore the dungeon, you'll sometimes meet friendly NPCs who give you quest-related information on what you have to do, with the game placing a greater focus on puzzle solving. The magic system was also expanded with new spells being added for both schools of magic. And in fact, the entire combat system received a much-needed overhaul. Now, characters in the back row could equip bows, slings, or tridents, so that they can now use physical attacks from the back. Not only that, but classes also receive new skills and abilities. So the thief, for example, can now use the hide ability. Basically, this lets you spend a turn to hide the thief from danger, and on the next turn, it'll attack your enemies with a greater chance of causing a critical hit. For context, in previous Wizardry games, thieves rarely did any combat really, and instead they were only used to open chests and disarm traps. That is, until you could finally graduate them into a ninja. But now, they were finally becoming more useful during a combat scenario. I know that these changes sound rather basic today, but we need to take into account that much of what we take for granted today was still new and groundbreaking back then. For context, Final Fantasy I had a thief class, but they were solely used for combat. The thief skills that they would later use wouldn't even come to exist until Final Fantasy III, which came out 2 years after Wizardry 5. And these changes were enough to bring Wizardry back. Not only was the game well received, but it also sold really well, both in Japan and the West. In fact, as far as the original games go, Wizardry 5 is usually held as the best one along the first game. Hell, I'd even argue that as far as Japan is concerned, this is the best Wizardry game out of the entire main series. So much so that almost every Japanese spin-off game uses Wizardry 5 as its basis. That is to say, it uses the expanded spellbook, the new class skills, and weapons that allow the back row to use physical attacks. One thing I forgot to mention in part 1 of this video is how the class change system works in Wizardry. You see, when you create a party, you don't just pick a character class and stick with it. As your characters level up and become more powerful, if they meet certain requirements, you can then change their class. When you do this, they revert back to level 1 and their base stats, but they get to keep any skills they've won in the meantime. So this means that if your character was a mage and you change their class to a fighter, they revert back to level 1 and you need to level them up all over again. But the payoff is that they can now cast spells while fighting the front row. So this means, for example, if that same character was also a cleric before then, you basically now have a warrior that can cast every spell from both schools of magic. Now granted, as a warrior, they have fewer spell slots than they used to, but this still makes them a very versatile character. And the fact that Wizardry 5 added new skills and spells means that there's now a lot more depth to how you want to build your party for the middle game and the late game. You could have a thief-cleric hybrid, for example, or a character who literally maxed out every class in the game. And in fact, once you take Wizardry's class system and compare it with Final Fantasy 1 through 10, you can really see how Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team were really just a bunch of Wizardry fans who spent their career experimenting with the formula. I mean, the classes from Final Fantasy 1, how they play, and how they evolve into advanced classes were mostly taken from Wizardry. Final Fantasy II did away with the classes and instead lets you pick what skills or spells should each character specialize in. Basically, a Wizardry class change system without the classes. Final Fantasy III lets you change classes at will, level them up individually. Final Fantasy IV is a more traditional class system, but in Final Fantasy V, we're once again back to a pure Wizardry system with you changing classes on the fly, leveling them up, and then mix and matching skills from each one. Like, this is as pure Wizardry as it gets! And for Final Fantasy VI, 7, 8, and 10, you're once again using a system without strict classes, but whose point is for the player to mix and match skills and spells as they see fit. It's like someone at Square looked at Wizardry and then looked at Final Fantasy V and then asked, what if we got rid of the classes but still kept the class change system? The job system, the materia system, the sphere grid. This is all Wizardry. It's people who loved Wizardry and kept trying different variations on the formula. Wizardry was just so influential in Japan that once you start accepting that almost every JRPG core mechanic dates back to this series in some way, shape or form, it actually becomes difficult to switch it off and stop seeing how they all connect back to Wizardry. It's about creating classes, but then choosing to not lock the player into a specific class, and giving you the freedom to build your party however you want to. But your punishment for doing that is having to grind all over again. In fact, the fact that Wizardry forces you to revert back to level 1 just so you have to grind and unlock more skills was a major influence in of itself. This grind-centered mechanic also helps explain why Japanese role-playing games are so obsessed with giving you the option to farm all the way to level 99 and having secret bosses that go above the level limit, while Western RPGs tend to cap out at level 20 or 40. It's because Japan's main source of inspiration for the genre was the grind-heavy Wizardry series. On the other hand, Western role-playing games tend to cap out at comparatively lower levels, which makes sense, because they lean more towards a pure D&D experience. It just boggles the mind in how Japan took this major detour in the RPG genre because of this one specific series. Unfortunately though, despite being a return to form for Wizardry, 1988 was very different from 1981. Competition was ramping up in both Japan and in the West. For one thing, games like Dungeon Master was already a year old and looked light years better than Wizardry in the graphics department. Final Fantasy was already on its second game, Dragon Quest on its third game, and even games like Phantasy Star were already out. Wizardry 5 was a success when compared to past Wizardry games, but it wasn't leading the flock anymore. Wizardry was selling thousands, but its competitors were now selling millions. A good example of this is that when the Game Music Concert returned in 1992 for its second outing, it only featured one song from Wizardry, the opening to Wizardry 5. Now compare that to the 1991 edition, which not only had twice as many Wizardry songs, but it even opened with Wizardry. And you can definitely take this as a sign of the series' waning popularity. The Game Music Concert would return 2 more times, but never again would it feature a Wizardry song in them. Series like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Zelda, Albert Odyssey, Fire Emblem, and Mother have thoroughly displaced Wizardry. Wizardry 5 is often considered the best of the original engine games, but it was simply too late. The long development cycle and disappointing release of Wizardry 4, coupled with the staunch refusal to upgrade its visuals and presentation, had made Wizardry feel like a relic of the past. Wizardry 5's gameplay was as strong and addicting as ever, but the rest was in a serious need of an overhaul. Now, if you want to play Wizardry 5, you have a few choices available to you. Once again, if you want the original, raw, and unfiltered Wizardry experience, then you want the Apple II version. Just like every other Apple II version, this one has no music other than the occasional beep, though at least the gameplay screen has increased from Wizardry 1. The MS-DOS version is pretty much the same as the Apple II version, except that the graphics were in CGA, so expect a lot more pink. And it's also where I got the inspiration for my channel's pink wizard logo. Wizardry 5 would also come out for the PC Engine. Unlike the previous PC Engine Wizardry games, this one is a standalone release instead of a compilation disc. But it still uses the same engine as the previous PC Engine games and looks the same as those. Then we have the Super Nintendo version. This is the easiest version to get, and also one of the best, though I do think that it's also the weakest Super Nintendo Wizardry game. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I think the backgrounds can be a little ugly at times, and some of the sprites don't really do it for me. But if you want a quick and easy way to play Wizardry 5 that also does a good job at representing the original, then this is the one to go. And there's also a fan-made patch that replaces the sprites of the Western version with the uncensored Japanese version. But if you want the absolute best version of Wizardry 5, then I need to paint you a picture. Wizardry 5 came out in 1988, and this next port came out in 1990. Now, before we begin, I just want to show you what RPGs looked and, more importantly, sounded like in 1990. So, we had Ultima 6 for MS-DOS. Phantasy Star 2 on the Mega Drive, and the Super Nintendo technically wasn't out yet, but here's Final Fantasy IV, which came out the next year in 1991. Okay, we're on the right mindset. Now let me show you Wizardry 5 released in 1990 for the FM Towns computer, what it looked like, but more importantly, how it sounded like. Yes! This is an RPG released in 1990 that uses a fully orchestral soundtrack, and it is incredible. Like, are you kidding me? A game released in 1990 sounds like this? And not just that, but they kept the Apple II aesthetic, but replaced the enemy sprites with high-resolution art. And the game even has an English language option right out of the box, so you can just play it as is. I know that this is not the first game to have a fully orchestral soundtrack. As far as I know, that honor belongs to Dragon's Lair.
Space Ace, defender of justice, truth, and the planet Earth. Ace is being attacked by the evil Commander Borg.
Hold your fire! Who is that creep?
But I'm almost certain that this is the first RPG to do so. This is the perfect Wizardry 5 port, and it's an absolute crime that it's stuck on a Japanese computer that honestly isn't all that easy to emulate. If you're willing to try and track this version down, then this is the way to go. If not, the Super Nintendo is still a good alternative. There's also the PC98 port, which is similar to the FM Towns version, but the enemy sprites are a bit more crunchy and the music is back to being synth, but it's still a good in-between version. Now, as we close the book on Wizardry 5, I should point out that there is a clear line that separates Wizardries 1 through 5 and 6 to 8. The first 5 are known as the Llylgamyn Saga. These were pure dungeon crawlers, and are the ones that Japan fell in love with. These are the ones that the JRPG genre bases itself on, and the ones that were the most influential. And they were also the ones helmed by the series' creators. Well, the last one not so much, but you still get me. Wizardry 6-8 is known as the Dark Savant trilogy, and for the most part, it was helmed by D.W. Bradley. Every game in this trilogy is considered excellent. In fact, Western fans tend to love 6-8 a lot more than 1-5, whereas Japan loves 1-5 but pretty much doesn't care about 6-8. Now, before we move on to the Dark Savant trilogy, I want to focus on how influential these first 5 games were to Japan, just to give you an idea. I've already mentioned how Wizardry was the basis behind Final Fantasy's core gameplay mechanics, the class system, materia system, and the sphere grid. But another interesting way Wizardry helped change the genre was in creating joke enemies. For example, in part 1, I talked about a slime enemy called Murphy's Ghost, an enemy with low attack stats but ton of HP that rewards you with tons of experience. And this is more likely where Dragon Quest got the idea for the metal slime. But there was also another joke enemy called the Vorpal Bunny. This is an enemy with low HP but a relatively high evasion rate. And each time it attacks you, there's a random chance it'll score a critical hit and decapitate you. This means that regardless of your level, equipment or HP, that party character will go down in a single hit. And this type of joke enemy is most likely where Final Fantasy got the idea for the Cactuar. And if you mix Murphy's Ghost high HP with the Vorpal Bunny's powerful attack, you pretty much get a Tonberry. It's kinda funny how there's a whole family line of joke enemies that basically spawn from these two foes. And what's even funnier is that a lot of Japanese players most likely didn't even realize that the Vorpal Bunny was a Monty Python reference. So, an American RPG referenced a British comedy movie which then became a thing in Japanese RPG culture, appearing in games like Shangri-La and Final Fantasy. And this game of cultural telephone has made it so that modern wizardry games made in Japan now pay homage to the Monty Python reference. The fact is that Japan's interpretation of Western fantasy is basically held by 3 pillars. These are Ultima, Wizardry, and the Record of Lodoss War. In my opinion, Ultima defined the overworld, towns, main quests, and side quests. Record of Lodoss War defined the visual aesthetic and types of storylines. More so than Ultima in this case, because early Ultima games were also a little goofy. I mean, you could time travel to 3rd of the century London, enter the TARDIS from Doctor Who, and gun down TIE fighters. It's very fun, but a little goofy. And when the Ultima storylines became more serious is also when Japan began losing interest in that series. And you can see this in how Ultima advanced the concept of choices and consequences, morality meters, and branching storylines. But Japan's RPG games pretty much ignored all of that. To be clear, I am not saying that Ultima had zero impact in Japanese Western fantasy outside of towns and quests, as both Ultima 1 and Final Fantasy 1 end with you traveling back in time to defeat the final boss. But I will argue that the bulk of Ultima's influence was in towns, quests, and the overworld. And then you have Wizardry, which I'd argue is the basis of it all. I mean, Ultima's combat was pretty simple. You just press a key in the direction of your enemy and combat happens automatically. But because Wizardry was so intricate with its combat, it helped define the basis of Western fantasy in Japan. Like, for example, what's an orc? And what's a goblin? How are they any different? What's the difference between a mage and a cleric? How is their magic any different? And what does a party of heroes need a thief for? Not only that, but the basis of how magic and combat works pretty much began with Wizardry. Even the first game already had an intricate magic system with healing spells, buffs, debuffs, status ailments, spells that damage a single enemy, an entire row, or the entire enemy party. This might all sound pretty basic and simple now, but in 1981, this was groundbreaking stuff, especially if you lived in a country where Dungeons & Dragons was still obscure. And if you want a smoking gun for how the basis of Western fantasy in Japan stems from wizardry, then look no further than the fact that kobolds are portrayed as dogmen in Japanese video games and anime. And this happened because the Japanese wizardry manuals redesigned them to look like that. So, in my opinion, this means that while the Western fantasy in Japanese video games is separated by wizardry, ultima, and record of Lodoss War, once you leave video games and start looking at anime, manga, and other media, I'd argue it becomes more of a pyramid, with wizardry at the bottom setting the rules, classes and monster types, and record of Lodoss War at the top defining the aesthetics and storylines. But of course, this is not a definitive rule. I mean, wizardry fans firmly believe that the series inspired the tone and aesthetics of the Dark Souls saga, for example, and I'm sure you'll find Ultima and other influences in all sorts of Japanese manga and anime. But as a general rule, I'd say these two properties were the main inspiration, and you can kind of see how one would still draw from the other if you know where to look. And it's probably a good thing that Japan took the art style in its own direction, because a lot of the enemies looked really goofy in the computer versions. And like I said before, once you start connecting the threads to how influential these first 5 games were to Japan, it becomes really difficult to not see it everywhere. But now, I think it's time we finally move on to the Dark Savant trilogy. This is Wizardry 6 Bane of the Cosmic Forge, the first wizardry game to not be part of the Llylgamyn saga. Well, actually, that might not be true, because Wizardry 6 keeps things intentionally vague. You don't know where it takes place or what the name of the land even is. All you do know is that in an abandoned castle there once lived a king and queen who dabbled in the dark arts, and they held something called the Cosmic Forge, a pen that, if used, it'll rewrite the fabric of the cosmos to turn what was written into reality. This game is a clean cut from everything that came before. For starters, there is no character import system, and you instead have to create a new party from scratch. There are also no towns or even safe zones. The game is basically one giant interconnected dungeon, and you'll often have to return to earlier points with new spells, items or skills. In fact, I've seen people say that Wizardry 6 almost has a Metroidvania vibe to it. And as mentioned before, there are no towns or safe zones. Instead, you can choose to rest at any time to restore health and mana, but you can also be ambushed while doing so. But conversely, any items you find will be done so through fighting, finding chests, or speaking to wandering merchants. But the biggest change of them all is the fact that the game is finally running on a brand new engine, with new assets, sprites, animations, and sounds. And boy howdy is it freaking ugly. Like, I get that it's a 1990 DOS game, but this is easily the ugliest game in the series. It's kind of funny how everyone basically agrees that the classic wireframe games have a sort of understated beauty to them. But once you hit the Dark Savant trilogy, opinions will vary wildly, with everyone thinking that any combination of 6, 7, and 8 are either beautiful games or hideous games. To this day, I've never met a wizardry fan who likes or hates the aesthetics of all 3 games. It's always some different combination, and my combination is that I think 7 is beautiful and 8 looks pretty good, but 6, woof. I almost want to recommend the Super Nintendo version instead, based on looks alone, which looks far better and fixes a few bugs from the original. But it also has a massive flaw that I'll get into a bit later. Another interesting thing is that in a complete role reversal of what we usually see in video games, the PC version of Wizardry 6 features a lot of enemies that I can't really show you. But these were all censored for the Japanese release, which is definitely not a common thing, especially not back then.
臨場感があふれる冒険空間が君を待つファンタジーロールプレイングゲーム Wizardry 6
Now, one thing I should tell you is that if you're going to play this game, you're better off installing a mod that allows for better character rerolls. Yes, the same character rolling system from previous games is still here, but this time they went a little too far. Likely because you'll only be using one party instead of a revolving door of characters like in previous titles. And as a result, getting a good amount of bonus points for your whole party can take hours. I repeat, hours. Even the official strategy guide at the time criticized the game for this. So just download an MS-DOS mod that allows you to roll for better stats almost instantly. It's like the old saying goes, it's not really cheating if everyone does it. Hell, even the Super Nintendo version has a ROM hack that basically does the same. So I say, go for it. And this mod is also compatible with the original, Steam, and GOG releases of the game, so there's basically no excuse. The PC version also has a bug in which your weight capacity does not increase as it should, so it's a good idea to install a patch that fixes this. Otherwise, you'll be playing through the game with some tight inventory constraints. Unless, of course, you want the extra challenge. But the Super Nintendo version fixes this bug right out of the box. Another thing I should point out is that Wizardry 6 is when the series really found itself in terms of character classes and evolution. You now have 11 races to choose from instead of the previous 5. The game keeps the usual humans, elves, and dwarves around, but it also introduces lizardmen, dog people, cat people, and even fairies. I've heard it said that Wizardry 6 is the first RPG that allows you to choose playable cat people. Which, I don't know, considering this game came out in 1990, it seems fairly late for that. I do know you have an actual cat as a party member in Phantasy Star 1, and a mutant with cat-like features in Phantasy Star 2, both of which predate Wizardry 6 by about a year or two. But I will admit that I can't think of any RPG before Wizardry 6 that lets you play as an actual cat person. But feel free to list any in the comments though. The game also ups the number of classes from 8 to 12, and every class has a lot more abilities, skills, spells, weapons proficiencies, and more. Not only that, but there's really no race and class combination that you can legitimately call useless. Sure, they each have their strengths and weaknesses, and some are better than others, but it's up to you to build a party combination that you're happy with. Wizardry 6 is a game that really promotes party experimentation, and you can have absolutely insane builds like a ninja fairy. I repeat, you can have a ninja fairy, and you might think that this is a stupid combination, but actually, no! Using a ninja fairy in the Dark Savant trilogy is basically a meme at this point. Ninjas value dexterity and speed, and like the Vorpal Bunny, their critical hits decapitate enemies. And fairies are small, quick, and dexterous. So what you're left with is a tiny little min-maxed, stealth-based pixie flying around, decapitating enemies left and right, and never getting hit because they're so small. But of course, if they do get hit, they go down in a single strike, because even a gust of wind is enough to take down a fairy. Now granted, ninja fairies are absolutely not a class for beginners, and it's a pretty terrible combination for the early game, but towards the middle and the end game, they become pretty useful. And by Wizardry 8, they are easily one of the most broken classes in the entire series. So yeah, this is a game that encourages experimentation, and you should never stop experimenting no matter how far you are into the game. Not only that, but Wizardry 6 is the first game that lets you save at any point. In the previous games, you couldn't save your progress. Instead, the game would only save your characters, their gear, levels, and whether they were alive or dead. So you'd always start back in the town, but your party was stronger or weaker depending on how you did. But here, you can now save scum all you want. The problem is that the developers know you're going to save scum, and so you're going to meet a lot more battles that will demolish you on your first turn. Heck, the start of the game is arguably one of the hardest parts because you're so weak, and you're going to be weak until you reach at least level 2 or 3. But even after that, you'll never really feel at ease, as each encounter always feels like it could be your last, and you need to strategize the best way to overcome. Personally, I recommend always keeping your manual nearby, and you'll need it too, because this game does not ease you into its gameplay mechanics. And at times, it's a little too complex for its own good. Like how when issuing physical attacks, you can swing, thrust, or melee, all of which have different damage and hit rates. Not only that, but you now have skills that go up as you use them, while others require you to level up and spend points. As I mentioned before, there are no towns or save spots, and resurrection spells don't come until fairly late into the game. Thankfully, you can find limited use items that heal or resurrect you. Permanently losing a character is still a game mechanic, but it now works a bit differently. Now, whenever you resurrect a character, it'll permanently lose a vitality point, and vitality points are what allow you to gain more hit points whenever you level up. So if your vitality is too low, the resurrection spell can fail and the character can even suffer permadeath. You'll also find the occasional merchant in the game, and you can even attack them if you want. But if you do that, that particular merchant is gone forever, so it's not really recommended. One thing that Wizardry 6 does really well is the story and tone. The game has an almost horror tone to it, especially with the story and narration. The plot is not only really well made, but it goes into some dark places that you'd never really see in games today. It tells a story about the evil rulers of the castle, but also how the king bought a 14-year-old girl as his personal slave, and how she was born out of a forced wedlock between her mother and the demon, and that because of her life, this girl is now evil incarnate. This is some really uncomfortable stuff, and when you do meet the spirit of the queen, she gives you a crucifix to take the girl down, as well as the lord of the castle who now has eternal life, and without the crucifix you can't even damage them. The game steers you in a specific direction, but if you pay attention to the details and lore, you can actually make a very interesting discovery. One that almost counts as a secret ending, but also changes your entire perspective on the game. When you reach the end of the game and have the crucifix with you, you'll be fighting the king and Rebecca, the previously mentioned slave girl, at the same time. And this is one of the most difficult battles in the entire Wizardry series. I have never been able to beat it actually. But if you instead remember that the evil queen was, well, evil, you can simply discard the crucifix she gave you. And when you do that, instead of fighting Rebecca and the king, they talk to you, and you learn that yes, the king was evil. He wanted power and eternal life, but after centuries of undeath, he's tired of living. He has no joy in his life, and his body does not feel pain or pleasure. He's now become a vampire, and he's simply surviving by feeding off others, but secretly he just wants his torment to end. I should point out that the only way to reach the Queen's chambers is by picking up a key that the Vampire King conveniently drops when he attacks you during the mid-game. And you can't defeat him without the crucifix the queen gives you. So what this means is that the king was steering you. He was leading you towards the steps you had to take to defeat him. But because you rejected the path they were making for you, the Vampire King was denied the release he wanted you to bring. So he finishes his monologue with a thought: as long as we fear death, we shall never be free to truly live. And with that soliloquy, he takes a wooden stake and plunges it into his own heart, finally embracing his own end. Rebecca then approaches you and reveals the truth. The king was evil and most of her life was wretched, but he was kind to her and treated her fairly. The two eventually became lovers, which... hopefully that didn't happen while she was still 14, but anyway, they became lovers and found solace in each other. But the queen was jealous. We learn that the queen ended the life of Rebecca's parents and implies that the pairing between her human mother and demonic father might have been more consensual than what was first described to us. But even that wasn't enough for the queen. She used the cosmic forge and wrote the death of the demon girl. But instead, the forge interpreted demon girl as herself. And so, it ended the queen's life while letting Rebecca live. And so, Rebecca leaves you. But before you leave her, if you tell Rebecca that you love her, she'll give you a diamond ring that can be used to heal up your party. And the cool thing about this ring is that if you import your party to Wizardry 7 and 8, you can carry it with you in those games. And to be clear, this is an exclusive item that you can only get in Wizardry 6. And nowhere else. So much so that in Wizardry 8, you can actually meet Rebecca's brother, and if you give him the ring, he'll thank you for it, thereby completing a hidden quest you didn't even know existed.
You have summoned me?
Is this Becky's? Oh, my sister. How I miss her. You must be the ones who saved her then. And still you have this ring. I can never thank you enough.
Finally, you're left alone and you find the pen, the cosmic forge that you were here for. And here, there are a few different variations, but it all leads to the same ending. If you take the pen, a robot teleports in and takes the pen away from you. Or you can find Rebecca's brother, a dragon-like demon, and he asks you if you want to chase after a cosmic lord. Regardless of what happens, you then board a spaceship and set off to space, on one ending to chase after the pen that was stolen from you, and on the other to find the cosmic lord. And so, the game ends on a baffling tone, to be honest. But yeah. This is how the game manages to avoid the world of Llylgamyn, by having it take place in just one big dungeon and then ending with a sci-fi plot twist. Personally, I think the spaceship thing is kind of weird and comes out of nowhere, but the story with Rebecca and the Vampire King is surprisingly well made and becomes very compelling once you hear their side. But so ends Wizardry 6, a game that took risks with the formula and modernized it in a way that was beloved by some, but hated by others. And while the Super Nintendo version still did fairly well in Japan, it was clear that the series was beginning to lose strength in that market, and most Japanese Wizardry fans would drop the Dark Savant trilogy with either 6 or 7, and move on to the Japan-exclusive spin-offs, like the Wizardry Gaiden series, which was a return to the classic formula of Wizardry 5. I guess it makes sense. Wizardry 6 relied a lot on save scumming, something which wasn't really possible in previous games. It also introduced a few non-combat skills that we tend to associate more with Western RPGs, like lockpicking doors to access rooms, some basic diplomacy stats, that sort of thing. But perhaps the final nail in the coffin for Japan was the art style. You see, I've been showing you the Super Nintendo and MS-DOS versions up to this point, but the issue is that the console versions didn't hit the scene until 4 to 5 years after the Japanese computer versions. So that means that the PC-98 and FM Towns ports were stuck with the ugly MS-DOS graphics and sound. I can only imagine what it must have felt like going from this art style in Wizardry 5 to this in Wizardry 6. Now, if you want to play Wizardry 6 and only Wizardry 6, your best bet is probably the Super Nintendo version. This one improves the graphics and audio considerably, and even fixes the weight carrying bug from the PC version. And it also has an automap feature, which is helpful if you don't want to draw your own. However, it's also a standalone Super Nintendo release, which means that you can't import your party to Wizardry 7. And that's actually this version's biggest flaw, because the Dark Savant trilogy places a great focus on importing.
What the hell was that?
You also have the Sega Saturn version, which is a compilation disc of Wizardry 6 and 7. So this means that you actually can import your party from 6 to 7. What's even more interesting is that the game basically remakes Wizardry 6 to fit the aesthetic of Wizardry 7, and it also makes dungeon navigation polygonal. I'm guessing that this might actually be the best console port of the game. But sadly, it's not in English, and as far as I know, no English translation of the game exists, which is a shame. I assume that a dedicated translator could probably reuse most of the dialogue from Wizardry 6 and 7, but until that day happens, this version is locked for us. There's also the FM Towns version, which looks just like the MS-DOS version, except, once again, you have an excellent soundtrack. Though this time, rather than using a fully orchestral soundtrack, it's a mix of synth and real instruments. It still sounds incredible though, and the songs seem to be remixes of the FM Towns version of Wizardry 5. And finally, you have the MS-DOS version, which is ugly, has terrible sound, requires 2 patches to improve the stat points and the weight, but it's still a really good game, and the best version of the game that we currently have. Or at least, it's the best version if you want to properly play through the whole trilogy. Despite Wizardry 6 being basically forgotten in Japan, and the rest of the world if I'm being honest, it manages to live on in a few interesting ways. The first is through the popular Netflix anime Delicious in Dungeon, where the author of the manga admitted that Wizardry 6 was the main inspiration for her series. As she watched her dad play the game, she kept imagining how all those monsters and creatures would survive while being trapped in a dungeon. And if you know where to look, you can definitely see how certain things in that world might be specific to Wizardry, specifically the Super Famicom version of the game, including manga panels which seem to draw inspiration from the game, the fact that the dungeon is controlled by a mad wizard, which could be a reference to either Wardna or the Cosmic Forge.
It's the Lord of the Dungeon. The Mad Mage himself.
And even a few original enemies like bugs and insects that disguise themselves as gold coins or treasure, which is most likely a reference to the creeping coin enemies of Wizardry. Not to mention that the quest is about a party going into the dungeon to find the body of a lost comrade and then resurrect it, which was a fairly common thing in the Wizardry games. In fact, when drawing up the concept art for the manga, The author even attributed wizardry classes to each character. So yes, as far as I'm concerned, this is a wizardry anime.
They are no match for us.
Another interesting way Wizardry 6 survived is that in the newest Wizardry game, Wizardry Variants Daphne, unlocking chests as you play a minigame that works just like the lockpicking one in Wizardry 6. It's a neat little reference that's likely to go unnoticed by most. And honestly, between this and Delicious in Dungeon, it's starting to feel like Wizardry 6 is entering its redemption arc in Japan. Back in the 90s, there was also a Wizardry 6 strategy guide launched in Japan called Wizardry 6 Bane of the Cosmic Forge Replay and Guide. This book is interesting in that it's part walkthrough and part roleplay of the author's party members. I've never read this book because it's never been translated, but as far as I understand, everything is written as if it were an adventure novel viewed through the eyes of the party members the author created. And the book was so successful that the strategy guide's main character, Femina, has become the unofficial main character of Wizardry 6 in Japan. I mean, hell! There are multiple pages across multiple wikis dedicated to Femina, including the Wizardry wiki and, most hilarious, the actual Nintendo wiki, where the page just outright lies to you and tells you that she's a protagonist of Wizardry 6, despite the fact Surtek most likely never even heard of her. That is insane! I honestly cannot think of a single game where an unofficial character became so popular that it just gaslighted the entire internet into not only thinking that she's canon, but that she's the main character! What is even going on here? Another thing I should point out is that this was the last game in which Japanese ports were handled by artist Jun Suemi. He's a Japanese artist whose works include the Front Mission, Fire Emblem, and the Brandish series. But more importantly, the influence his works had on shaping the Japanese perception of wizardry and Western fantasy in general cannot be understated. Jun Suemi did most of the art for the console ports of Wizardry. This includes video game covers, manual illustrations, concept art, and promotional art. And these would often be turned into the enemy designs within the games themselves. So if you've ever wanted to know why kobolds are lizard people in the West but dog people in Japan, it's because Jun drew them like this, which then made it into the game. This isn't to say that Wizardry's success in Japan was solely due to Jun Suemi. After all, the Famicom version of Wizardry launched in Japan the same month as the original Final Fantasy, and a full year and a half after Dragon Quest, which means that Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, and many other Japanese game developers during this time were hooked on the computer versions of Wizardry, which used the Western artwork. But it is interesting to see how Jun Suemi managed to take the perception the Japanese had with Wizardry and how they viewed it as this nihilistic grimdark series and give it new life with his art, which in turn became the standard tone for the series in Japan. And now that the series has been owned by Japanese companies for over 20 years, it has now become the official tone of the series worldwide. Well, this video was a lot longer than I expected, and because of that, I'll leave the final 2 entries for a future video. But before we end here, ever since I made part 1, people kept asking me what is the best entry point for the Wizardry series. And I'd say that varies greatly depending on what you're looking for. But for my money, here are the best entry points for a newcomer to the series. If you want to play the original trilogy, then I'd recommend Wizardry 1, 2, 3 for the Super Famicom and Wizardry Llylgamyn Saga for the PS1 and Sega Saturn. The Super Nintendo game has better art style and music, but requires a translation patch. whereas the PS1 and Saturn versions have better quality of life features, like an auto map that you can bring up at any time and rerolling characters instantly. And the game also comes in English right out of the box, and both of these remakes allow you to import your characters to the sequels. The remake of Wizardry 1 is an excellent way of playing the original Wizardry, and the one that is most easily accessible. It's also the easiest port of Wizardry ever made, and that is because when you change classes, you retain your max HP before the class change. This is a small change that may or may not get patched in the future, but it does mean that you can have a mage with the HP of a warrior, which is pretty funny to me. Wizardry Tales of the Forsaken Land for the PS2 is one of the few Japan-made Wizardry games that actually launched in the West. I've only played a bit of it, but I really enjoyed it, and everyone basically agrees that it's one of the best games in the series. It also has an interesting gameplay mechanic where your party can consist of a mix of NPCs you recruit and characters you create from scratch. Wizardry Labyrinth of Lost Souls for the PS3 and PC was the first Wizardry game to launch in the West since 2001. This is basically a return to the more classical formula, as it feels like someone just took the formula of Wizardry 5 and applied the modern coat of paint to it. As a result, it can feel a little on the basic side, but if you want the classic Wizardry formula as seen through the eyes of Japan, then this is the one to play. And finally, we have, and I can't believe I'm saying this, the best Wizardry game we've had in 20 years. And it's a mobile gacha game, because of course it is. I'm usually not big on mobile games or gacha games, but this game feels like the studio made an RPG first and the gacha game second. The gameplay is addicting, it evolves the formula in new and interesting ways, and even the story is good, with a few plot twists that I honestly did not expect. The game is free to play on mobile and Steam, but be warned that it's also a notoriously buggy game, with 2 botched launches on mobile devices and PCs. Not only that, but the PC version installs some really nasty DRM, and it's such a bare-bones port of the mobile version that it doesn't even have a button to quit the game. You'll just have to Alt-Tab and then close the game. Because of this, I recommend the mobile version. And yes, I know that mobile games and gacha games can elicit a lot of hate. But assuming that the studio hasn't decided to go all in on the pay-to-win mechanics yet, I'm going to say give this one a chance.
There. They are no match for us. Here I come. Flash!
And that's it for today. I'll be sure to cover Wizardry 7 and 8 in part 3 of this series, whenever I actually get around to making it. In the meantime, I'd like to thank my newest Patreon supporters, including Canon Ward, Cosmonaut, Professor Gast, Kilo Money, Cypher2790, Christopher Potter, TGM, Martin Helkvist, Hubs GVN, Mr. Tagomago, and BW. Thank you for helping make the channel better. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!